Hello, my name is Bruce Pattinson and welcome to another Total Education Centre video. Today I'm going to talk to you about Kenneth Slessor's poem William Street. This is a little bit of a more mature poem than some of the other ones we've talked about, but it still contains that ambiguity that we see in Slessor's poetry and some of the more interesting facets. I'd like to start by having a look at William Street and reading through it for you, and then I'll go back and go through it and talk to you a little bit about the meaning of the poem. William Street. The red globes of light, the liquid green, the pulsing arrows and the running fire. Split on stones go deeper than a stream. You find this ugly, I find it lovely. Ghost trousers like a dangle of hung men in pawn shop windows bumping knee by knee, but none inside to suffer or condemn. You find this ugly, I find it lovely. Smells rich and rasping, smoke and fat and fish and puffs of paraffin that crimp the nose, or grease that blesses onions with a hiss. You find it ugly, I find it lovely. The dips and moles with flippant shiny gaze, death at their elbows, hunger at their heels, ranging the pavements of their pasturage. You find it ugly, I find it lovely. And that's Slessor's William Street. 4 very simple stanzas, nice flowing rhyme scheme, and the repetition of that last line, you find this ugly, I find it lovely, at the end of every stanza reinforces the ambiguity of the poem, what he's trying to get at. And Slessor, when he wrote William Street, wrote some commentary later on about it, and as I said, it's a poem of ambivalence. It's a later poem, more mature in style. And this is what Slessor wrote when he talks about William Street. He said in his article in the Daily Telegraph of the 31st of July 1967, William Street was a sort of flashlight photograph of the swarming city channel that runs up the hill of King's Cross, taken on a rainy night when the surface of the road is coated with a slick of reds and greens and whites reflected from the neon sky signs, the red globes and pulsing arrows. He also said he wrote it as a defence of metropolitan fascinations against those who considered the city ugly and found beauty only in the outback. And I've talked previously in the Pretext and Context video of Slessor about how he was trying to make Australian poetry more sophisticated and far more mature and move away from the bush ballad style. And this poem's one step towards doing that. Now, if you don't know what William Street is and have never been to William Street in the city, you probably, what I would do now, it's a street, I wouldn't say visit it necessarily, because it's a sort of sleazy part of Sydney now, populated by strip clubs and beers in the middle of King's Cross. And it's a centre for drugs, prostitution, those sorts of things. In Slessor's time, it had elements of that, but it was a little more bohemian and home to more creative types of people, not just the sleazy people that sort of hang there now. If you want to have a look at William Street, the best thing to do is go and Google Earth it, is what I do, and you can range up and down the street without actually having to go there, and it's well worth a look to see the sort of place it is and the neon that he talks about and the people that he talks about, the pimps and the moles and all those sorts of things are still there. Those 4 equally structured stanzas, and he ties them together with that, you find this ugly, I find it lovely. And so we can now focus on what the poem's about. The colours of the poems, you need to pay attention when you read William Street to the very sensual visual imagery that he conveys in this poem, and it's part of that Slessor technique that we've talked about previously. The visual images are extremely strong in that first stanza. The realism of the reflected lights takes on certainly a more primitive feel with Slessor as the persona pointing out running fire built on stones. This sacrificial sort of image goes on to a more vital kind of life that we find in the city, the vitality of desperation that we see in the characters at the end of the poem. And I'll go back to that last stanza later, but just remember that in that first stanza these visual images are very, very intense and very strong. And Slessor's seeing the negatives of the city, but being very positive about it at the same time. This concept of the sacrifice is supported by the continual movement in the poem imagery, the pulsing, the more natural image of the stream, which is an unusual word for such a cityscape. this stuff for Slessor is beautiful, and his theme and concern, he does find it lovely. Even with the darker images in the second and final stanzas, the poet still finds something positive to find lovely. In the second stanza, for example, the images of ghost trousers and hung men are seen in pawn shop windows. And the positive that comes out of that is he says that these second-hand clothes have no body in them to suffer or condemn. And they are very much like hanging men. It's a wonderful visual image again. This is an important point as Slessor sees the beauty but makes no moral comment on anything in the poem. He is the observer and he likes what he sees. And that's an important point in this poem, that Slessor doesn't take on any moral tone about the people, their position, what's going on in the poem. All he does is describe it and say that he really likes and enjoys the life and the action and the movement of the city, and that those things contain their own certain type of beauty. It's not the beauty of the past that we came to admire in Australia, that landscape and the bush ballad and the horses and the gum trees and all those sorts of things that were very prevalent in early Australian poetry. This is a far more sophisticated type of poetry and an understanding of where Australia's gone and where it's moving on to. The third stanza again takes the reader to a more sensuous image of the smells. So we get back to those five senses that we've talked about so constantly in Slessor's poetry. The smells that are rich and rasping, clear and descriptive here. He sort of lists a catalogue of smells that give the area its own feel and texture. They're strong smells, very strong, and the alliteration of the S sound gives a sense of cooking oil in some sort of cafe that we see, that searing heat that comes away, that repetition of that S sound. Here again, the alliteration within the phrases, rich and rasping, puffs of paraffin, gives a sense of rhythm, making the scene more immediate. He tries to take us into that place and see the beauty that he sees, the action and the movement and the life in that scene. The poet also returns to the religious imagery of the first stanza with the language of blesses and the hiss of the snake, and that ties back into that sacrificial image that I talked about in that first stanza. This kind of contrast is used in much of Slessor's work and can be used as a link between the poems, as you can do with all those thematic concerns that I've talked about previously in analysing. If you're unaware of that, go back and have a look and view very carefully that first Slessor video, the pretext and context video, because that will give you the idea of the things to look for and the way you need to go about it. The final stanza deals with William Street and the people that inhabit it. The dips, which are pickpockets, and the moles, who are the prostitutes, are a real and vital part of what is in the city and that beauty. They add, with their words like death and hunger, they add the humanity to the city. They give it that touch that makes it so very different from the country. They do not walk the street but range the pavement like wild animals. And he's comparing it, the pavements of the street, the cityscape is much like the outback in the way that people manoeuvre it like animals. These dark images are central to the contrast again and the repetitive line, you find it ugly, I find it lovely. Slessor uses the full extent of his poetic technique in this poem. Go back to the ambivalent images, the movement of time, and that whole central concept of the difference between the city and the country. So how can we analyse it even further? Slessor's persona in the poem is more of a guide, and he never makes any moral comment, as I said. He sort of walks along the street giving us a natural description of what's going on. He focuses on that natural life and says it's like nature, the way it goes with the stream and the pasturage and all those sorts of words. Again, we talked about the use of senses, especially sight, words, sounds, smells in this particular instance, to immerse us fully in that city, give us that rich, vivid imagery. He talks, what he finds lovely, I think, in this poem is the energy of the city and how it's been elucidated in words such as pulsing and running. As I said before, 2 and 4 stanzas 2 and 4 are a little bit bleaker in tone. Don't forget to look for things like the alliteration of the S sound that I've already talked about, the simile, like the dangle of hung men and other sorts of things. So how can we talk about this language technique in a little bit more detail? Slessor himself wrote in that Daily Telegraph article, he speaks about the language of the poem and what he tries to do with it, and he says, "I have attempted to create a neon-lit, metallic and floozy atmosphere by the deliberate use of assonance." And now we all know that assonance is a resemblance of sound in words or syllables. The kind of assonance used not so deliberately in the vulgar old comic songs which still delight me. You'll see that I have rhymed in this way such words as green and stream and men and condemn. Does it give you the feeling I meant? The blame is not yours if it doesn't, for the experiment can be studied only by the writer on himself, and no experiment can pass beyond stupid tinkering or exhibitionism unless it has a purpose and unless it achieves its purpose. So what Slessor's asking you to do there is think about the poem in your own terms and think about what you get out of the poem and how you find it. Do you find it ugly? Do you find it lovely? How do you view the city and the way it works? In other words, in conclusion, I'd like to say to you, what do you decide about William Street? Does Slessor try and convince you? Or if he does try and convince you, does he convince you that the city is a lovely, wonderful place? I don't think he does convince us. It just depends on your opinion, what you see. Whether you see it as lovely or whether you see it as ugly. And it's a very personal opinion. And this leads me to think that's a poem about aesthetics in its overall context and how we see the world and a little bit more about us. And it's a little bit more sophisticated than, say, Country Towns and Wild Grapes. It's asking us to look at ourselves in a personal way and what sort of aesthetics we have, and how you as a reader and as a person in the world understand that sense of our place in the world and how we see it. And I think this poem asks you those things and makes you do it. William Street, a very, very Australian poem about a very, very Australian place, and certainly one that Slessor liked and thought well of. My name's Bruce Pattinson. Thank you for joining us today. I'm doing these videos on behalf of Total Education Centre. Don't forget to look for the tips and questions at the end of this video and make use of those. If you have any comments or questions, you can always whack the like button down below, write me a comment or ask me a question. We're only too happy to talk to you. Thank you for listening again, and I'll see you soon.